All right, so let's get into the organization of the human nervous system. So I put a little graphic, slightly freaky graphic to the right, and it sort of separates the central nervous system, which is just the brain and spinal cord. That is pretty much the executive for all of your nervous functioning. And then the peripheral nervous system is everything else. So all of your sensory organs, any nerves that are coming off of your spinal cord, any nerves that are connected to your brain that innervate your entire body, they receive input. Um, your sensation and perception, that's all captured by the peripheral nervous system. It's shuttled to the central nervous system and then back out to the peripheral nervous system. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So here is a flow chart of the nervous systems. The central nervous system is off to the left. Obviously, there's nothing branching off of it because, as this says, it's mission control. There are no significant ways to further divide the central nervous system. But the peripheral nervous system, obviously, because it's much larger and it has a lot of functions, there are a lot of subcategories we can divide it into. So the first two being sensory and motor neurons. So your sensory neurons conduct signals from the receptors to the central nervous system. Receptors are, any sort of sensation input, like if you feel a touch. The sensory neurons are responsible for taking that input, bringing it right up to the central nervous system. The central nervous system will process it, probably send it to some lobe in your brain that's responsible for processing touch. It'll come back down, and that's how we feel the sensation. Those are also called afferent neurons. So the difference between afferent and efferent is that one is going towards the central nervous system and one is coming away from the central nervous system. So a trick that I use to remember that I was taught in undergrad is that afferent is arriving. They both start with A. So afferent is arriving and efferent is exiting. So AAEE. So you can keep in mind that sensory neurons, are afferent because they are arriving. Motor neurons are efferent because they are exiting. Anna, you said parasympathetic and GI is opposite, right? What do you mean? I know the parasympathetic response on the GI tract, there is a specific parasympathetic response that we'll talk about in a little bit. Is that what you're referring to? Increases activity? Yes, if that's what you're talking about, yes. For the most part, the parasympathetic response will increase GI activity, which we're going to get into in a couple of minutes. Keith, so the central nervous system is just your brain and your spinal cord. It is mission control, as this diagram says. It basically makes all the decisions for your nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is everything else. Anywhere we're getting input, anywhere in your body, your nervous system, the nerves, anywhere that's not your brain or spinal cord is your peripheral nervous system. So it's basically the system that brings information to and from the central nervous system. So the afferent neurons, as we just said, bring it to the central nervous system, they're processed, and then motor neurons or efferent neurons bring them away from the central nervous system. So those motor neurons, can be further divided into two more categories, the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So the autonomic, obviously, as it says, is the involuntary response. So that's your sympathetic and your parasympathetic responses, fight or flight. It mobilizes bodily systems, parasympathetic rest and digest response, and conserves energy. So we often think of the sympathetic and parasympathetic response as a response to like an immediate stressor, which often is the case, and a lot of times you will see it in that context on the MCAT. But it's important to know that the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems also just mediate, your day-to-day nervous system activity. So I think I have a couple of examples on the next slide. And the somatic nervous system, I think we'll talk about a little bit as well, is just the voluntary movement control. So that's just your voluntary muscle. The skeletal muscular system is innervated by the somatic nervous system, that striated muscle that we control. Okay, so a little bit more on the sympathetic and parasympathetic response. The sympathetic response is the fight or flight response that is activated when an animal is exposed to a stressor. But obviously, like I said before, it is also still active when we're not in the presence of a stressor. But I would definitely try to know as many of these as possible. Once you figure out the pattern and you really have an understanding of the sympathetic and parasympathetic response and what their goals are, you can start to intuit this. So like if you're not like really keen on remembering things, just like bland memorization, you can figure it out. So like digestion slows, for example. We know in the fight or flight response, epinephrine is released, digestion is going to slow, because if you're in a life-threatening situation, it's not very efficient to divert blood flow and divert energy to digesting food when you have a 600-pound animal in front of you that's trying to kill you, for example. Same thing, urination is inhibited, bronchodilation occurs, your lungs open up, we're increasing oxygen intake because we're burning energy really fast because we need it in that situation. Sweating, vasoconstriction occurs. The vasoconstriction, your blood vessels get pretty small, that increases your heart rate, that increases your blood pressure. So we're getting more oxygen, more nutrients to the target tissue faster, and more of it in a small amount of time. Dilation of pupils occur. It allows you to see farther distance, the release of epinephrine. One example of the sympathetic response not during a time of stressor is the sympathetic response is responsible for orgasm during sexual functioning. So on the other side of the coin, the parasympathetic response is the rest and digest state that an animal enters when no stressor is pregnant. So in the context of fight or flight, you can think of the parasympathetic response as the come down. Digestion starts to be active again because now we're trying to conserve our energy. We're trying to carry on our regular metabolic functions as efficiently as possible because we're not in the presence of a stressor anymore. So we don't need to divert our energy to the current situation. So again, everything else is intuitive once you understand it. So the digestion is active, which makes sense because it slowed when we needed to divert energy away from it. But now that we have the time, we're going to digest our food and get our nutrients. Urination may easily occur as well. Airways are constricted. That doesn't mean that they close up to the point where you can't breathe. It just means that they're not dilated to the point as they would be if epinephrine were present, as indicated by the sympathetic response. Pupils are constricted, same thing. We're focused on energy conservation and metabolism. There's an increase in saliva production because, as Anna mentioned before, and as we just spoke about with digestion being active, saliva production is a part of digestion. So that's going to increase when we're resting and digesting. Vasodilation, our blood pressure goes down, our heart rate goes down. We don't need to spend so much ATP pumping all of that blood because we're not using as much. And again, I just wanted to put right at the bottom that just daily activities, sexual arousal as opposed from orgasm is actually mediated by the parasympathetic response. Well, as Anna so colorfully put, sometimes epinephrine and other hormones, cortisol is a stress hormone, for example, that can be released during the fight or flight response. So those sort of anxious responses that you will have, they're going to happen just because of the situation that you're in, and that's more of a psychological thing. But from a GI and a physiological standpoint, digestion does slow. So, I mean, if you had something, in the tank ready to go already, then that might exacerbate it. But the digestive system as a whole does slow and blood flow is diverted away from it. Hope that kind of answers your question. And does anybody else have any questions on this before I move to the next slide? So Opal said, if vasoconstriction is occurring when I'm running away for help, how do I scream? Well, vasoconstriction is your blood vessels. So I don't think that they will constrict enough to make you not able to speak. So hopefully if screaming is your plan of action and it works for you, hopefully you'll be able to scream. You guys got some interesting questions. Why when some people are dying, they pee or go poop? I don't think that that has anything to do with the sympathetic or parasympathetic response. I think it just has to do with like the body muscle contractions after death, rigor mortis, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in other lectures, how ATP plays a role in muscle contraction and why that happens after death. But A+ for being inquisitive.